So if you picked two people at random out of the population and had to guess who was more aggressive, and you guessed the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. That's about the magnitude of the difference between men and women.
Well, that's 60-40. It's not that much of a
That's
margin,
right.
is it?
That's exactly right.
Right.
But, and this is where things get more sophisticated. All right, so then imagine that you had to pick the 1 in 100 most aggressive person and put them in jail, which is what we do. They're all men. So even though at the midpoint, the difference between men and women isn't that extreme, at the extremes, the difference is extraordinary. And most of the activity, or much of the activity in complex situations, happens at the extremes. So men are more interested in things than women are, and women are more interested in people than men are, on average. And those differences are largest in Scandinavia, by the way. So there's no evidence that they're socioculturally constructed. And one of the consequences of that is that if you leave men and women to make free choices...
Well, let's put aside that Scandinavia is not just one country, and it has lots of different cultural, political differences within
Sure, but the
Scandinavia.
point is that, and this is the fundamental point, is that the more egalitarian the country, the bigger the differences between men and women. The bigger.
I have no idea how one could possibly
conclude
conclude that.
You rank order countries by their sociocultural policies, from egalitarian to non-egalitarian, and then you look at the magnitude of the differences in temperament in men and women in those countries. And you do those analyses
Depending on
and
your
you publish
definition
them.
of temperament.
Yeah, but there isn't a definition of temperament that exists that's valid outside of the psychometric community.
Well,
and so this is
in that case, we're
science.
locked into a particular definition within what you call the psychometric community. And other people may simply say, look, I experience the world very differently, and I have evidence from my dealings, whether I'm a man, whether I'm a woman, whether I'm looking at how we get along together and what we do to improve matters, that doesn't conform to that. I mean, you know,
the question is then, what is the evidence? The fact that someone has an
question,
opinion about it isn't relevant. The relevant issue is what the evidence suggests, unless you're willing to throw out the scientific enterprise, which I wouldn't recommend.
No, I'm not. I'm certainly not doing that. But I do think that to pin it to a narrow definition of psychometric testing
it's not
is
narrow.
probably
It's five-dimensional.
recursive.
It's five-dimensional. It's not narrow. The whole world only has 4 dimensions. Five-dimensional model is actually extraordinarily sophisticated.
If it's got 4 dimensions and then we've into 5, that's magic.
Well, you have 5 dimensions. There's many multi-dimensional spaces, but reality itself has 4 dimensions, and there's plenty of complexity in that.
Let's come back to your evidence. Absolutely come back to evidence, but also to what you make of the evidence, because trading.
All I make of the evidence is that there's multiple reasons for gender differences.
So what do we then do with this? Let's say that we decide that there are differences, and we can argue whether it's about the average. I mean, who is the average woman? Am I the average woman? Are you the average
in some ways probably, in other ways not.
Right. Okay. Good to know. So what do we do with this? So it takes us into this argument about what progress should look like. And the gender pay gap was a good example of that. As you say, lots of different ways of describing it, lots of different approaches to dealing with it. The challenge to you would still be, I think, do you think that the situation that we have is broadly fair in workplaces, and that women are self-selecting out of progress up the pay chain, rather than being, to an extent, under either pressure of child rearing that is not probably accounted for, or that they're not properly helped with? Is it really all about their decision, or might structures not play a role here? One doesn't have to be completely mad to think this, right?
No. What you have to be completely mad is to reduce the whole thing to gender and to assume that it's a consequence of oppression. There's multiple factors at play, and prejudice is one of them. The question is to what degree prejudice, or an arbitrary categorization, let's say, and the lack of provision of opportunities for women is contributing to the pay gap, and to what degree other factors are contributing. So there's other factors. Like I said already, men are much more likely to do dangerous jobs. They're also more likely to do jobs that scale. So, for example, because women are more interested in people on average than men are, they tend to work in people-oriented enterprises, and those are hard to scale. And because you can't scale them, it's harder to multiply the income. Men are more likely to move than women are. Men are more likely to take on trade positions. They're more likely to work with heavy machinery. They're more likely to work outside. All of these things add to the...
But if you cashed out, sorry to interrupt you there, but if you took out working with heavy machinery, which some women do, but more, we will say, right, more men will elect to do that. There's quite a lot of things in there where they're being nudged. We're all nudged throughout our life to certain choices. We don't have to accept the nudge. But then would you accept that women have lacked opportunities that they've like the nudge has not operated in the same way. So for you to say,
Over
they end up
over what time span?
Well, you can choose your time span. Say 100 years if you like.
I would
don't
say
really mind the time span. The point is, are women, in a sense, already going through a number of gates in life, and some of them are wider than others.
It's complicated. I mean, I think men were directed down narrow pathways in ways that women weren't. So, for example, they were much more likely to be conscripted into wars, for example, which actually happens to be a non-trivial phenomena because it resulted in the deaths and the demolition of many men. And so both sexes are subject to the arbitrary strictures of culture. And perhaps you could argue that women had the worst time of it, although it's not that easy an argument to make. I would say that the extra pressures of child rearing and the inevitability of pregnancy played a very large role in that, and we didn't deal with that effectively till 1960. And so one of the things that I really don't like about the women were oppressed by men throughout history narrative is the fact that both men and women were terribly oppressed by nature throughout history, and that's not being factored into the equation. And I think that what men and women did for most of history, the decent ones anyways, was team up and partner up and try to make life the least amount of miserable for both. And yet we read this narrative backwards and we say, well, the reason that men and women weren't operating equally in the sociocultural landscape was because men were oppressing them. It's like, sorry, no. That accounts for a tiny fraction of it, or some proportion of it, but it had much more to do with the fact that everyone was poor and miserable and that women were locked into a reproductive cycle from which they had no practical escape. And we didn't fix that till the 60s.
What might irritate some working women, indeed some women, whether they work or not, is you can either sort of look at something like the gender pay gap and sort of pick apart how difficult it is, or you could say, well, let's try to fix this, and let's have an intelligent argument about how we best fix this thing. And the argument that women are self-selecting out of the workplace becomes a bit of a roadblock.
Yeah, but women do self-select out of the workplace all the time. Well, if you look at the legal profession, that's absolutely crystal clear. Women are overrepresented at the lower ends of the legal profession, but they stop operating at the high ends in their 30s, and it happens in all sorts of professions. And there's good reason for it. I mean, what happens? Well, because women in their late 20s tend to decide that they don't want to work 80 hours a week. They would rather have a family and devote some time to that, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
Another possibly reasonable thing to do is for the child-rearing roles of men and women to come more into balance than allowing, with some trade-offs, life being imperfect, allowing women to come back earlier into the workforce.
Well, yes, but that also assumes that what women want to do is come back. That's the argument
that you put. You put it on the women.
Well, no, not at all. That's not a fair characterization in the least. Your argument is predicated on the idea that the advantage to women is in coming back to the workplace. But many women decide, especially once they have children, that having their children and spending time with them is actually more valuable than going back to the workplace. And that's a reasonable thing to decide. In fact, you might think it's the intelligent thing to decide.
Well, a lot of women do then come back into the workforce, and their pay is then lower.
Well, that's something that you had mentioned earlier, and the fact that women pay a disproportionate price with regards to long-term career earnings if they become mothers. That's a very narrowly focused problem, and it's a problem that might need to be addressed. But that's not the same as the gender pay gap. It's a much more defined problem.
Yes,
and part of the problem is, how do we best...
Can we get you to carry a banner for that part of the feminist crusade then?
Not if it's part of the feminist crusade, no. Because that would mean I'd have to carry a banner for what I regard as a rather reprehensible ideology. But I do...
Overall, feminism is a reprehensible ideology?
Well, what percentage of British women regard themselves as feminists now?
I don't know.
7%.
Well, it depends how you ask a question, I would guess.
Well, no, the reasonable measurements of it estimate there's something like that. It's a very small percentage.
Really?
Yes, really.
Well,
it's a very small minority, even if it's not 7%. And part of the reason for that is...
Would that make it inherently wrong? I mean, I'm not sure it's 7%. And, but I think that's one on which we could all go and bandy a bit of research on the isms. But would it necessarily be such a bad idea? I mean, you must have sometimes stuck up for minority rights, even if the idea is right.
Of all,
as you say in your book,
women aren't a minority, by the way. They're actually a majority.
Precisely so. So in that sense...
They're not minority rights that we're talking about here if we're talking about female rights. Have I stuck up for minority rights?
Yes.
I don't see the world
Well, you've
from
said
that
the
perspective.
7% example would suggest that even a small group within women thought that feminism was that you just decide yourself whether feminism's a good thing or not. It doesn't really matter.
Well, I think it's not a good thing because it plays identity politics games, and I'm not a fan of identity politics games and the collectivist viewpoint. I don't think that men should be set against women. I don't think that we should view the world as a competition between men and women. I don't think we should view history as a structure that pitted oppressed women against the oppressor men. I don't like that story. I think it's a nasty story, and I think it's designed. It's destined to divide us in ways that will not be good. I think it's a story fundamentally predicated on resentment. I don't think it's an accurate view of the way things unfolded in the past. And I don't think women were as powerless or as unable to contribute as the feminists claim they were before, like, 1960.
But earlier you thought that things did come into balance for women in the 60s, so something changed.
I thought,
something was good about the 60s, yes?
I thought that the birth control pill was invented. And the reason that women have far more flexibility, let's say, in their lives now is fundamentally because they have more control over their reproductive status. And that never really happened until the 1960s.
Yes, but they may have built other conclusions on that other than that, great, I can control my fertility. It's great, I can control my fertility. Now what is the question that we're tussling with?
Well, that is, but that's exactly it. That is precisely the question that we're dealing with. But the causal order of that is, oh, now I can control my fertility. Now what? That's a biological revolution.
But that has consequences for men as well as women, right?
Of course it does.
Good.
And there are consequences.
So what do men have to change? We've had a lot of focus here on how women have had it better than that perhaps you think that modern feminists think they have.
I don't know.
Do men need to change?
I don't know if women had it better than modern feminists think they had it. I think that if women had it hard in the past, which they certainly do, that the amount of that was attributable to male oppression is far smaller than the feminists claim, because nature had her hand in that. You know, the average person in the Western world in 1895 lived on less than $1 a day in today's money. That's below the UN guidelines for poverty. So life was very hard for men and women for almost all of human history. And to view that as part of an oppression narrative on the part of men, I think, is one of the things that is very hard on young men, for example, when they're trying to take their place in the world. So how would men have to change because women have control over the reproductive function? That's an open-ended question. I don't know. Casual sex is much more available than it used to be. That's one way that men have been able to change. They haven't had to take on responsibility for adopting a long-term monogamous relationship in order to get sexual access. So that's a big change. It's also enabled men to not grow up to quite a great degree.
I'm not sure if you're welcoming that or
I'm not saying it's a good thing. It is very complicated.
So movements that bring that whole difficulty of the mating game or the hookup culture into the debate must therefore be a good thing, and presumably you would also I don't think presumably, but would you welcome that?
I think there's very little good about the hookup culture. I think there's very little good about casual sexual relationships. I don't think they're good for men or for women. And I mean,
where do you stand on the Me Too campaign? Good thing?
I think that it risks damaging the presumption of innocence. I mean, there's plenty.
Is there more to it than that?
Oh, sure. Women face the arbitrary admixture of sexual advance and workplace performance all the time. It's a very complicated thing to sort out. We don't know how to sort it out exactly because, NBC, for example, the American TV station, has made it policy that you're not to hug your co-workers, which, may be true, although I don't think it's the sort of thing that a corporation might be deciding for people. But we don't know exactly what the rules are for governing male and female behavior in the workplace because we've only been working together for about 35 years.
We don't know. After 35 years, wouldn't it be possible to figure something out?
Not when you're talking about a transformation in behavior that's that profound. I mean, we don't know how men and women can work properly together in the workforce. It's very complicated.
But
men don't know how to compete
millions
with
of men and women across the world go to work together day in, day out.
But you were the one who asked about Me Too.
You're the one who. Don't start with you're the one who.
Me Too is an expression of the fact that men and women are having a hard time regulating their behavior in the workplace. That's the only reason I responded to that. Because the question was posed.
I think it's more broadly suggesting that some men are having a grave problem with it. What is the lesson of the Harvey Weinstein story for you?
someone should have said something about Harvey Weinstein much sooner.
But we could start somewhere else. We could start with Harvey Weinstein was wrong to do what he did before we get other people should have spoken out. That's a secondary order issue.
Fair enough. I thought that went without saying. There are going to be psychopathic predators. They're going to exist. And what has to happen is that people have to stop them because they won't stop themselves. And so I thought that was sort of implicit in the statement. Obviously, he shouldn't have done what he did.
But you don't think that the culture in which he was operating, that there was particularly in his world,
Hollywood?
In his world and in many other worlds, that there was a culture of, this guy's a powerful guy, he's the great silverback gorilla here, let him get on with it.
Oh, I think that culture was everywhere in Hollywood, which is why I think
Not
it's
just in
actually
Hollywood?
quite... Well, Hollywood particularly. I mean, the casting couch idea has been around for a very long period of time. And I think that the Hollywood types who are all upset about this should look to their own devices with regards to the role they've played in fostering the culture that managed that. So
it sounds like the
Hollywood
itself, or the women, or who?
No, the entire culture. We were talking about culture.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's certainly that the Hollywood...
What's the sensible thing for women to do about Me Too, to your mind, and what's the less sensible thing?
That's a hard question. It isn't obvious to me exactly what men and women have to do in the workplace to make that kind of sexual predation much less likely, with also subjecting themselves to restrictions on the sexual aspect of their existence that would be unbearable. It's very difficult.
What would be unbearable about that?
How about everybody wears the same uniform to work? That's what the Maoists... Well, look, if you want to eliminate the differences between men and women sexually at the workplace, you have to constrain the sexual differences. I mean, men wear suits to work.
Well, we don't have to eliminate the sexual differences for people to work together with respect.
You have to eliminate them to some degree.
Why? I'm genuinely
because you're trying
puzzled.
The question here is, to what degree should sexually related behavior be impermissible at the workplace? Well, it depends on how you define it. Should you be able to dress attractively? And if you can dress attractively, what do you mean by attractively exactly? Like precisely. I got into trouble.
I mean, I hope I dressed nicely today. You look very well dressed to me, right? You're a man, I'm a woman. We're both nicely dressed. Now we're getting on with the interview. What's the problem or perspective?
Well, the problem is the boundaries of what constitutes nicely dressed. Because because part of what constitutes attractiveness, part of what constitutes nicely dressed is sexual attractiveness. Because you can't separate out human attractiveness, sexual attractiveness, from human attractiveness. And so then the question is exactly where are the boundaries? And that's what the discussion is about. Where are the boundaries?